difficult for Ukraine in any reasonable time period to sort of force the Russians back all the way to where they were in 2014. So the only solution to this war is diplomacy and getting them to a table where that's possible.
Today's meeting, though, won't involve Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, though he was in the same city yesterday where talks will be held today. You see him there on the screen. Zelensky met with the Saudi crown prince, saying on social media they had a, quote, detailed discussion on the steps and conditions needed to end the war. Secretary Rubio and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz met separately with MBS for more than 2 hours. They also discussed the war in Ukraine, as well as the reconstruction of Gaza. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, meanwhile, Keir Starmer, spoke with President Trump yesterday about today's talks. The UK readout of the call said Starmer expressed his desire that today's events lead to a positive outcome, quote, that would enable U.S. aid and intelligence sharing to be restarted. That's a key point there. But as talks designed to end the war continue, Russia has stepped up its attacks on Ukrainian territory, and now Ukraine is launching its own retaliatory strikes. Russia's defense ministry said overnight its air defenses shot down over 300 Ukrainian drones in 10 different regions. This video shows the moment a drone slammed into the top of a building in Russia's Moscow region around 4 a.m. local time. And joining us now, former spokesperson for the U.S. mission to the United Nations, Hagar Shamali. She also worked at the National Security Council and the Treasury Department. So what's your assessment of where things stand right now regarding a potential peace deal, and what are you looking out for from these talks today?
Right. You have a lot going on at the same time. Well, so Ukraine is, after the disastrous meeting you had in the Oval Office, which was only 10 days ago, if you can believe it, they are trying to see if they can find a way to work with Trump and the Trump administration. And the reason is that Zelensky knows that Ukraine needs the United States. And on the flip side, coming from the Trump administration, you're seeing maneuvers that weaken Ukraine's position in these diplomatic negotiations. And that's concerning for me for a few reasons, in part because that goes against the policy of the last 3 years, and it also undermines the investment the United States has made in Ukraine over the last 3 years. Whereas even if you had the Biden administration saying we want Ukraine to win and we want Ukraine to be able to defend all of its territory and its sovereignty, the fact is that there are many who have always known that it's possible that Ukraine would never fully push Russia back. And as a result, the goal was to put Ukraine in as strong a position as possible for negotiations, because negotiations are inevitable to end a war. And so if you're going to put it down, if you're going to force it to end now, if you're going to push that settlement for the Trump administration, and you're doing something like taking away the intelligence for Ukraine to be able to strike Russian targets, that's what they've done. They're getting intelligence that are defensive in nature if an attack is coming, but not to strike inside. That's a message Putin is hearing, and he's hearing, okay, well, clearly I'm the favored side, and they don't, and that the U.S. doesn't want to do anything that would push the war further. So it weakens Ukraine's position, which will push Zelensky toward an inevitable settlement of some kind.
A settlement of some kind, one that Europe is clearly stepping up their posture to be a part of on the Ukrainian side of this. But I think it's interesting the way that Rubio is not just at the table, but also seems to be talking about, OK, we're here to sense how close the Ukrainians could be for peace, what concessions they might need and whatnot, but how serious Russia is about this. That's certainly out of step with the way that his boss, President Trump, has talked about this. But how might that manifest? Just the fact that they're at the table trying to see what's possible here.
Yeah, so you definitely have seen Secretary Rubio be more realistic on Russia and has, by the way, for a while now. Obviously, he has been more outspoken in Russia's role in starting the war and in its aggression for sure. But he's also trying to not predetermine any kind of outcome. And I think that's a negotiating tactic. Part of it is because he wants these talks to be seen as a success if a minerals deal doesn't come out of them. And a minerals deal might not come out of it. He claims that they're going to be talking about that intelligence sharing. That intelligence is really important. It's not something that Europe is equipped at the moment to backfill. And that's something I heard when I was in Munich at the Munich Security Conference. Every European official kept saying was, we have to beef up our intelligence because we rely on American intelligence intelligence. And so things like that. And he claimed that they're going to be talking about security arrangements. And I want to say it's not unheard of for deals to be struck with countries between the United States and others where we have access to their resources in exchange for security arrangements that we offer. So hopefully they make some movement there and not a minerals deal that doesn't offer anything from the United States. So I think it sounds like they're going to talk about all this. Steve Witkoff said that he's hopeful for how the talks will turn out, but I do think that this unfortunately puts Ukraine in a weaker position.
Yeah, hopeful for how the talks turned out. And even as Rubio talks differently than his boss, you say he's a realist. I'm not sure if realism is rewarded, but we even saw it on display in that meeting that turned this entire relationship on its head. Rubio was nowhere, basically sunk into the couch, quiet as J.D. Vance and Trump went at Zelensky during that meeting. And then finally, I want to get your take on, we mentioned how Russia is reporting that Ukraine launched a wide-scale drone barrage overnight. What do you make of that? The larger escalation in action overseas. Is it a pressure tactic here on the talks, or is it both sides trying to show that they've still got fight left?
Yes, so that attack that Ukraine pursued against Moscow overnight is the largest drone attack against Moscow that we've seen yet. And the timing is not coincidental, of course. The goal there is Zelensky to show force, to show that he's still got a lot left in him and in Ukraine, and that he's not going to go to these negotiations or any negotiations with his tail behind his legs and in a position of weakness that he fears the Trump administration is trying to put him into. He's trying to show that they have a lot of fight there left. They have a lot of creativity. They have a way to show their strength on the battlefield, and so he's trying to remind everybody of that. And on the Trump administration side, when it comes to Russia, I'm sorry, I don't think I answered this right fully on your previous question. In terms of the levers of power they have to bring Russia to the negotiating table, they seem to be dabbling in the question of using sanctions as that lever that they're pulling. One minute I hear they're going to be lifted. The next minute I hear they're going to be more. It's very inconsistent, but it's clear that the Trump administration does feel, although they've shown this public favoritism toward Russia, they feel they do need to use these levers of power to get Russia to the table.
Yeah, because at the same time, they're in a trust but verify posture, and the verify piece of this is very much actively ongoing. Hagar Shamali, as always, thank you for joining us. Welcome back. If it's Tuesday, voters are voting somewhere. Today, that somewhere happens to be Greenland, a territory that President Trump has said he wants as part of the United States. Today's snap election was called last month by Greenland's prime minister, who stressed that Greenland is, quote, not for sale. But the territory's largest opposition party has expressed openness to seeking closer ties with the U.S. The Greenlandic government has banned campaign donations from foreigners, that following Trump's comments about his desire to annex the Danish territory. And as the Trump administration continues its push to slash the federal workforce, new reporting finds the Secretary of Defense is expected to cut as many as 10% of all general officer and flag officer positions across the armed forces. Officials familiar with the planning tell NBC News the effort, which has not been announced publicly, would call for the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and Space Force to cut the total number of generals and admirals by 8 to 10%. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has argued too many of those positions leads to wasteful spending and too much bureaucratic decision-making. The Pentagon did not immediately respond to a request for comment. Meanwhile, Secretary of State Marco Rubio says the U.S. is officially canceling 83% of programs at USAID after a 6-week purge at the agency. Rubio made that announcement yesterday, saying about 1,000 remaining contracts will now be overseen by the State Department. He took to social media, writing the program spent tens of billions of dollars in ways that did not serve and in some cases even harmed the core national interests of the United States. He also thanked DOJ's hardworking staff who worked very long hours for this reform. Hours later, a federal judge ruled President Trump has overstepped his authority by shutting down aid assistance, but didn't order the administration officials to use the money to restart those terminated programs. And finally, NASA will shut down 3 offices and slim down its staffing as part of the Trump administration's ongoing efforts to cut the federal workforce. The layoffs were announced in a memo to employees yesterday. NASA's Office of Technology Policy and Strategy and its Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Accessibility branch will both be eliminated. The cuts come ahead of a Thursday deadline set by the Trump administration for agencies to submit plans for layoffs. This as top roles are also on the chopping block. NASA is eliminating its chief scientist, climate science expert Dr. Catherine Calvin. Her job was part of a 20-employee downsizing this week, but could be a step toward a deeper workforce cut at that agency.
The spending bill does nothing to protect Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Quite the opposite. House Democrats will not be complicit in the Republican effort to hurt the American people.
If House Republicans want to support real legislation that helps American families, and they want to do it in a bipartisan way, all they have to do is call Leader Jeffries and work with House Democrats. But they have so far been unable and unwilling to do that.
Welcome back to Way Too Early. It's 5:30 here on the East Coast, 2:30 out west. I'm Vitali, and that was House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, as well as Democratic Caucus Chair Pete Aguilar, criticizing the Republican Party's stopgap funding bill yesterday on Capitol Hill. House Speaker Mike Johnson is looking to hold a vote on that stopgap measure later today after the House Rules Committee advanced the bill last night. But with a shutdown looming at the end of this week, it's unclear whether or not Johnson has the support he needs. With no Democrats on board, maybe no Democrats, Johnson will need the majority of his conference to get the bill over the finish line. He's already lost the support of Congressman Thomas Massie of Kentucky, which means he can only afford to lose one more. As of this morning, several Republicans, including Congressman Tim Burchett of Tennessee, have indicated they're on the fence. President Trump, for his part, is ramping up a pressure campaign on those potential Republican holdouts, writing this about Congressman Massie, quote, "He should be primaried, and I will lead the charge against him. He's just another grandstander who's too much trouble and not worth the fight." Joining us now, congressional reporter for The Hill, Michael Schnell. All right, so I've been hearing a lot of Republican lawmakers who are saying, I'm a no, but I'm not a hard no.
Right.
So is that just their way of saying, give me some attention and maybe I'll come around on this? Because many of them have never voted for a continuing resolution before.
Yeah, the dynamics here are so odd because some of the biggest backers of this continuing resolution are people who are usually the biggest opponents of the continuing resolution. I'm talking about you, House Freedom Caucus. But as you mentioned, a lot of these holdouts are saying, I'm a no right now. I'm a no, but there's a path to support. I'm a no, but I need some answers to some questions about the bill. I think part of this is people want their moment in the sun. Maybe they want a phone call from Donald Trump, a little bit of attention. But we're not hearing any hard no's other than Thomas Massie. And I spoke to him yesterday. There's no chance of getting him on board. He is a hard no. And of course, if Johnson can keep the defections to just Massie, that would be enough to get it over the finish line. So I think that the final hours before the vote today are going to be crucial. I think that outside Mike Johnson's office is going to be the hottest place in Washington because you're going to see lawmakers shuffling in and out, having these last minute conversations. But I will say the pressure from Trump is going to make this really difficult for any Republican to vote against this. Let's think back to just a few weeks ago when Republicans passed that budget resolution, and that was really looking in dire shape.
Yeah.
But Donald Trump's last minute haggling ended up getting over the finish line. He's already making those phone calls now. We saw him turn up the heat on Thomas Massie overnight. So I think that, you know, while there are some undecideds on the fence, there's a good chance that they do fold.
Well, and Massie always colorful in his opposition, saying, I'd have to have a lobotomy between now and the time that I have this vote for me to ever vote yes. But the way that the White House is making this sell to Republicans that never vote for this kind of legislation is basically saying we'll work on impoundments and rescissions, which is the very fear that Democrats have and the reason that leadership is saying no way we're going to go along with this. And it's because it's basically the White House saying, don't worry, we actually won't respect some of the funding that you guys are allocating in this bill. That's kind of crazy, but it's working.
And this was one of the key concerns that Democrats had throughout this entire shutdown showdown. The thing that they were asking for was language in the legislation that would ensure that Trump directed the funding as appropriated by Congress. Now, important to note, that's the law.
Right.
But there was this concern, as you mentioned, with DOGE getting into full effect and Elon Musk and Trump trying to reduce the size and scope of the federal government. There was concern that that money wouldn't make it from point A to point B. So that's been one of the biggest concerns. And then the other concern is that this continuing resolution, it is a continuing resolution. It is continuing funding levels from FY 2024.
Yeah,
but there are
in
cuts.
2025 right now, not just in year, but also in fiscal year.
That's right. But there are cuts, right? They are plussing up defense funding by a number, but about $13 billion they're cutting non-defense funding. That's sparking a lot of concerns among Democrats that some programs that their constituents favor are going to suffer from the resolution, the measure. So it's going to be interesting to see how this shakes out and how Democrats approach this. I know the top three Democrats have said that they plan to vote against this: Hakeem Jeffries, Catherine Clark, and Pete Aguilar. But Jeffries conspicuously would not say yesterday if his entire caucus would vote against it. And I spoke to two moderates yesterday, Jared Golden and Marie Gluskamp-Perez. Yeah. They frequently buck Democratic leadership to vote with Republicans. Golden told me he'd have a statement out soon, but would not give me a sneak peek. Gluskamp-Perez just simply saying, have a nice night.
Have a nice night. And we'll see if they do as they ultimately take this vote. It's around 4 o'clock, at least as of right now. But let's live in a world where this doesn't actually work out, where Trump is not able to flip these reluctant Republicans. And even if those two Democrats get on board, let's say it's not enough. What's plan B?
Johnson was asked that very question yesterday, and he said that we are going to pass this bill, essentially suggesting that there is no plan B.
He never entertains them.
That's right. That's right. I will note that the top the top Democrats in the Appropriations Committees, Rosa DeLauro and Patty Murray, yesterday they released their own stopgap that would extend government funding till April 11th, giving folks more time to work through the regular process, pass those 12 spending bills. But the deadline is Friday, so if this fails, lawmakers are really back at the drawing board trying to figure out how to get out of this hole. And I suspect that we're going to see Hakeem Jeffries come to Mike Johnson with a number of demands and requests, because as we know, government funding always has to be bipartisan.
Yeah, always has to be bipartisan, but hasn't always worked out well for the speakers that take that path. One Kevin McCarthy, we are talking to you. Michael Schnell, thank you as always, my friend. Busy day on the Hill. Time now for business. For that, let's bring in CNBC's Charlotte Reed, live with us from London. Charlotte, markets took another huge tumble yesterday. This is how we started our show. How are things looking for this morning?
Indeed, yesterday, one of the worst day on the stock market since 2022, a market sell-off that is entering its third week, and it seems to be intensifying. It has wiped out $3 trillion from the S&P 500's peak last month. It's following a series of soft data, and investors increasingly worried about the Trump administration's policies on tariffs as well, and the flip-flops that we see in Canadian and Mexican goods, and what all this could mean for inflation and the U.S. economy. And you had news like Delta Airlines cutting their outlook, saying they have weak domestic demand, kind of pointing maybe to a darker outlook for the U.S. economy, and also Goldman Sachs trimming its outlook as well, following Morgan Stanley for the U.S. economy. So we see this nervousness playing out. The White House is downplaying this sell-off, saying, look, they have billions of dollars being invested into U.S. economy, and so they see a potential clearer outlook for the U.S. economy, but all are pointing to something negative short term. And at the moment, the U.S. futures are higher this morning. A bit of a pause ahead of some key inflation data they were expecting on Wednesday and Thursday. So more insight into the U.S. economy there.
You mentioned the nervousness in the markets, and one of the key reasons for that is the ongoing tariff war. Ontario, Canada is hitting back at President Trump's tariffs by applying a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to 3 U.S. states. How could that affect consumers?
Indeed, the levy will increase costs by around $10 per megawatt hour for U.S. customers, and that will affect roughly 1.5 million households and businesses in Michigan, Minnesota, and New York. And in a press conference yesterday, Ontario leader Doug Ford said he didn't want to do this, but that this levy will remain in place until the threat of tariffs from the U.S. is gone for good. And he said he will not hesitate to increase the charge or shut off the electricity altogether. Now, you remember after threatening a blanket 25 tariff on Mexico and Canada, the Trump administration announced some exceptions last week, but certainly some tariffs on steel and aluminum are still expected to go ahead this week.
Ripples of uncertainty throughout the various sectors of the economy, the stock market, even through crypto. CNBC's Charlotte Reed, live with us from London. Thank you, as always. Welcome back. Crews began dismantling Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington, D.C. yesterday. The large yellow printed street mural located just 1 block from the White House. You see it there on the screen. It was first created in the wake of George Floyd's murder and the racial injustice protests in the summer of 2020. The road work to remove the painting is slated to take about 6 weeks. D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser ordered the mural dismantled amid pressure from Republicans, who now control both chambers of Congress and, of course, the White House. President Trump has made reversing diversity programs a keystone of his second term. That mural is set to be replaced by several city-backed murals. Joining us now, editor-at-large for the nonprofit news publication The 19th. She's an MSNBC political contributor as well, Erin Haynes. Erin, if you could just give us a sense of what that mural meant to activists that fought for racial equity after the death of George Floyd. This was one of the epicenters of the protests in D.C. I spent a lot of time there when I was covering these protests 5 years ago now.
Yeah, Allie, I mean, if you go back just 5 years ago, you had this racial reckoning in our country in the midst of a global pandemic, people taking to the streets in cities like Washington, but really across the country, to have protests. And really, this was its own kind of protest, this Black Lives Matter mural in the Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington, D.C. I would say, that mural was probably one of the more prominent murals of its type then. There were these kinds of murals that went up on streets in cities across the country. But this one literally led up to the front door of the White House, as you mentioned. But obviously, like you said, millions of people across the country were protesting the ongoing police killings in the midst of this pandemic. But clearly, our nation and the District of Columbia are now in a very different place 5 years later.
This does feel like an acknowledgement of that from the D.C. mayor and a reality of being in Republican-controlled Washington that is also trying to basically take back the idea of home rule, which is the idea that D.C. is allowed to govern itself. Talk a little bit about the pressure that the mayor is facing and how this might be one of her ways of reckoning with the new reality of Republican Washington.
Yeah, again, I mean, such a different scenario for Washington Mayor Muriel Bowser, Democratic mayor, one of several Black women mayors in the country that was pushing back in this way with this mural. At that time, you had D.C. really kind of pushing for statehood, even in these years since they've had home rule. They've been seeking even more autonomy, even more agency, seeking to become the 51st state. But now that Republicans control all three branches of government, you have these attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and so-called woke culture in America by Republicans. And so, Washington, D.C. has been roiled in the past, several weeks since this new administration took office. You've got Washington really enduring so many of these federal job cuts and could now be impacted by this budget fight. And so you have a city and a mayor that really is not only trying to maintain funding for itself, but literally its autonomy with even the question of home rule now being on the table after more than half a century of being able to govern itself.
Very much caught in the cross currents here. Erin, while I have you, because we are talking about the events of 5 years ago, 2020, you spoke recently to Breonna Taylor's mother 5 years after she was killed. Talk a little bit about that and the way that she's being remembered now.
Oh, thanks for asking about that, Allie. So, yes, I did have a chance to talk to Tamika Palmer, the mother of Breonna Taylor, who was killed in the midst of that pandemic 5 years ago this week. And that was a story. It was really one of the first stories that I wrote for the 19th, which also turned 5 this year and was born in the midst of this pandemic. But Breonna Taylor's story was largely unknown for the first 2 months after she was killed because we were in a pandemic, because that story didn't really rise to the level of national prominence that so many of the stories of the Black Lives Matter era had gotten in the midst of us dealing with that global pandemic. And so I had a chance to talk to her about, her ongoing fight for justice for her daughter. And, that fight continues even under a new administration that obviously is openly discussing no longer taking up cases of police violence against Black people in this country. That's something that has loomed so large over our country in the better part of the last decade, and the future of that is uncertain. And so that is certainly something that's distressing to her. And so her fight continues also under very different circumstances in our country.
Aaron Haynes really elevating these important threads years after and doing that work. Thank you, as always. I so enjoy your reporting. Earlier in the show, meanwhile, Elon Musk says Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona is a, quote, traitor for supporting Ukraine. It comes after the Arizona Democrat described a recent trip to that country where he met with military officials and medical staff who are caring for the wounded. Musk's attack came a short time later, after which Kelly responded, quote, Elon, if you don't understand that defending freedom is a basic tenet of what makes America great and keeps us safe, maybe you should leave it to those of us who do. Joining us now, managing editor at The Bulwark, Sam Stein. So first, just start where we ended right there on Musk wading into a United States senator visiting a U.S. ally and saying you're a traitor for doing so.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Up is down once again.
It's crazy for a variety of reasons. Obviously, because Mark Kelly served the country. There's really nothing traitorous about going to Ukraine, which is ostensibly still our ally, although that's debatable, I guess, at this point.
Yeah.
And then secondarily, look, he's a sitting member of the United States Senate. You could, in theory, use his support, maybe his vote on a government funding bill that's coming up, where you will need 60 senators. And having the top White House ally, the top White House aide, I should say, of President Trump, going out there in public and just launching these attacks, which are, frankly, way further than we are accustomed to for simply, essentially, Codel.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what the purpose is served by that.
And certainly we've seen bipartisan Codels to Ukraine.
Right. I mean, Tom
years.
Tillis was in Ukraine.
Correct.
Not so long ago.
Not but a few weeks ago.
Yeah, came out and said, actually, no, I went to Ukraine too. I don't think I'm a traitor for doing so. Notably, Elon did not call him a traitor, so this is obviously just partisan warfare.
And we've seen Musk lash out at Democrats on Twitter, too. Senator Tina Smith and Patty Murray. I mean, he's gone after senior folks, too. So this is not just for Mark Kelly, but certainly striking in the larger foreign policy landscape. But sticking with that, we're going to see really the next salvo of negotiations between U.S. and Ukraine. Right. That's happening in Saudi Arabia today. Anything that you're looking for? I mean, we know the last tete-a-tete was
What are we looking for at this point in these one-on-ones? I mean, the bar has been set so high.
So high.
We obviously, there's a few things. One is intel sharing, right? Is it back on? Do we know? Trump hinted that it was, but he left the specifics very blank. So we want to know, are we going to have more intel sharing between, or will it be turned back on between Ukraine and the United States? Same with arms shipments. Are we going to be going back to that well? The minerals deal, is that being signed? Will there be any paper that we can see? What does it mean necessarily? And frankly, body language, right? Like after what happened in the Oval Office, everyone is just sort of attuned to, are they on good terms? Is there tension there? We will see. I don't really know what to expect because ultimately it always comes down to the principle, right? And the principle is Trump. And if Trump just simply doesn't want to support Ukraine, wants a deal, and is keen to give Russia what it wants in order to effectuate that deal, what does it matter what Rubio's saying in Saudi Arabia, right?
Yeah, it does, exactly, especially as most cabinet secretaries lately seem like they have been slightly out of step with where Trump himself is. Right. Look no further than Howard Lutnick, the way that he was talking about a recession on Meet the Press this weekend, saying, no way, there's not going to be a recession. And then Trump is on Fox the same day saying, well, maybe. I mean, this, when you think about it from a politics and a voter's perspective, this can't be, or maybe it is, what Trump voters bargained for. I've spoken to some who say the federal government cuts are great, but the tariffs?
I don't think it's what they bargained for. Maybe I'm crazy, but I don't think the voters were like, yeah, I want to have a recession and short-term pain and all these cuts and really a lot of instability. But it's ironic and weird in a way. We were talking about this at our office yesterday. So many people are out there being like, I never really thought he would do tariffs, or I never really thought they would do government cuts, or really like they're going to be this chaotic. And it's like, well, yeah, I thought that. I mean, he said it. Like, this was, again and again, this is what he wanted, and this is who he is. And to a degree, we were kind of deluding ourselves, or they were, I should say, about what would happen in this administration. I will say, I have been surprised at how quickly it's happened, and to your point, I have been surprised by how undisciplined the messaging has been. It's one thing to not have the same talking points. It's another thing to literally be on opposite sides of whether a recession will happen. And that sends a signal that the White House doesn't have its stuff together.
And once again, it underscores the fact that all roads go through Trump, regardless of which administration official
There would
you're
never be
to.
a White House where they woke up in the morning and the econ team got together and the comms team got together and they're like, you know what? Today, let's open the possibility of a recession. That should be our talking point. No, that's just not what you do.
No, absolutely not. Certainly one that we will be tracking, though, politically and economically, as we always do. Sam Stein, as always, my friend, thank you. We're going